Okay, so now we're ready to model that whiskey glass. First thing I want to do, if you're new to Modo, is just take you through the UI real quick before we get modeling. I'll give you sort of tips and shortcuts along the way, but just the first thing to kind of notice is how Modo's viewport is set up. Now, I like to work in this more traditional, what they call a tabbed viewport session. I normally work inside of my model quad. You go to just a default modeling perspective window here. Next is your paint layout. This is where we're going to do any painting or sculpting. In this case, we'll use a little bit of sculpting. Your read topology tab. This is great if you have a high-res sculpted character and you want to actually read topologize over that. We're not going to cover that in this tutorial series. Your UV tab, we'll probably take a look at that later on when we're putting the wood grain on the ground. This layout tab, this has all these sort of mesh presets, and this is kind of just nice for quickly building, dragging and dropping, and building a 3D scene. We won't use that for this particular series. Your setup tab, this is where you can find anything for doing all your rigging, things like that. Your node editor. Animation tab has all your nice animation layout controls. And we're spending a lot of time, most of our time actually, sort of in the model quad. And in this rendering tab, this is our integrated preview render engine. So that's just going through the viewport types. Again, we'll go through all this as we work our way through this. But if you wanted to, if you just hold Control on your keyboard and Tab, you also get this nice little pop-up menu. And this is, we can just continually hit Control Tab and cycle through. That's kind of like Mac OS view browser style. And we can just pick our render window and jump right in there. When you see that, we won't actually have those tab viewports on top. So you're going to get a couple of extra little pixels, some screen space. Again, we can Control Tab back to the model viewport. That's obviously one way to work. I particularly like to work in this tab viewport here. Now, if you hit 0 on the numpad, that's going to go full screen into one of these windows. If you don't, there's a way to change that input. If you don't have a numpad, you're working on a laptop, you can change that in your input editor. Might be able to show you that later on, or do a quick search online. But these little viewport controls here as well, if I click that, we're just going to maximize now into this right viewport. And if I click that again, we're going to maximize out. Or again, the shortcut for that is 0 in your numpad. So that's why I kind of work always in this model quad. I can just jump into my top viewport. If I 0 in the numpad, jump back out. But a lot of people like to work just traditionally in this model viewport here. One nice thing is if I hit 0 in the numpad for that guy, we're going to lose all our keyboard or in all our sort of palettes here. I have this big, nice viewport for just modeling. That's kind of more once you get into the advanced stages and you know where all the keyboard shortcuts are for your modeling tool set. So I'm going to hit 0 again to jump back out, or again right up here, this little icon, this maximize icon. Now once we're in this perspective viewport right now in the model tab, if I hit 1 on the numpad, that's going to take us to this top viewport, which you'll see up here. 2 is the front, 3 is the right. Period, we'll go back to our perspective, again on the numpad period. Or if I hit it again, once we're in that perspective, it'll take us to the camera viewport. You can also access these controls by hitting Control Spacebar, and that's going to bring up a nice little pop-up for you to jump to top, bottom. Again, to bring up that floating palette is Control Spacebar. But just my general working way, I always kind of work in this model quad and jump in and out of these viewports as needed. We'll go through plenty more of the UI as we go along. But first thing we want to do once we start in a new scene is actually save it. So in our item list over here, this is actually our scene. All scenes come in with an empty mesh layer. You can see the word mesh is grayed out. We haven't actually named that yet, or there's no polygons in there, so it's grayed out. And you're always going to have a camera in your scene and a directional light. So this is just a brand new basic Modo scene. And since we already set our project, if we come to here and we'll do a save as for our scene, that's under the file menu, save as. It's going to know again to put us in that whiskey render directory in the scenes folder. And let's just call this, we'll just call it whiskey glass. I like to My personal workflow is do capitals with no spaces between the words, and I'll do an underscore '01. Every studio has their own file structure. Everyone has their own. You could have spaces in here. You don't need to underscore. Just the way I work is capitals for every new word with an underscore for a version number. So I'm going to hit save, and now we have a new scene. You can see over here, it's now been saved. So the way I start most projects is with one of these primitives. You see we have a cube primitive, a sphere, a cylinder, and a cone. One thing I use very often, if you hold Shift and click that, you'll see this little plus icon pops up. So if I hit Shift and plus, that's going to create a new item type based off that primitive, but it's going to create a nice default 1 meter cube. I do that very often. I'm going to hit undo to get rid of it, jump back to our empty mesh layer, and that's actually where we want to add our polygons to. So if I wanted to, instead of just hold Shift and create that default one, I can click our primitive here and begin to draw it out. Right now I'm just clicking in the UI in the top viewport. If you grab this little green icon here, or the thumbnail, we can pull that mesh up. And here, over in our tool properties, where we can actually numerically type in how tall we want it. So we wanted this to be 1. If I hit 1 and enter, it's going to automatically do 1 meter. I could type in 1 foot, as you see here, and it's going to create it at 1 foot high. So you can obviously type in how big you want it to be, and then hit enter or apply down here at the bottom. And that created that cube inside of our empty mesh layer. Once again, I'm just going to do Command or Control Z, undo that, get back to our empty layer here. And since we're doing a glass, let's pop into our reference again. We'll always be referring back to these. What's the obvious shape we're looking at? It's a cylinder. So let's jump into Modo, and we're going to draw that basic silhouette of that cylinder out with our cylinder primitive. Again, I could hold Shift and actually click that, but that's going to add way too many edges. It's going to add 10 or 12 loops around, and I think, or 12 loops around, I think 24 around the edge and 12 high, but we don't need that. It's a little overkill. So I'm going to undo. Now let's draw out that primitive. So I'm going to click my cylinder tool, and if you wanted to keep this aspect locked, if I just click and drag, you can tell we're going to get kind of a squished and squashed shape here. Hit undo again, but if I hold Control when I draw that out, you'll see my aspects are actually locked as a kind of a square, keeping my aspects proportional. You see I all drew out here at 1 millimeter, or 1.11 meters. Clearly we don't want to do that, so we want to numerically type in the radius of this glass. So maybe let's just do 2 inches on X, and if I hit tab, it's going to jump down to the next field here. So I might do 4 inches high, and again 2 inches in Z. It's not quite right. It's going to be a little too skinny, but we can shift that as we go along. One thing you want to keep it in is centered in your scene. So in the position field, I'm going to hit 0, tab, and you saw that just kind of jump here, and now that is centered in our scene. But really, we have too much geometry in here. We don't need 24 sides. If I take this little icon here and pull it to the left, it's going to add less sides. If I pull to the right, it will add more. And we're going to be doing this as a sub-D model. So normally 8 sides is plenty to keep that. You'll see it's very rough and faceted here, but once we go into the sub-D modeling workflow, we'll show you a little bit more about that. And in terms of segments, that's these vertical crossbands, we don't need 12. So I'm going to click and pull all the way down to 1. Now that we have that, I'm going to hit spacebar and drop my tool. So clearly you can see this it's not really that accurate in terms of the aspect we want to create on our glass. It wants to be a little bit fatter and shorter. But we know this is 4 inches high. I mean, that's just a rough guess. If you wanted to enter in specific dimensions, you would have done that there in the field. But now what we want to do is scale this. We're going to want to move it up and also scale it. Now the shortcuts for your transform tools would be W. Well, let's click the item here. W is our move tool. E is your rotate tool. R is your scale tool. Or you can find those over here in this basic tool palette. Once you activate a tool, when you want to drop it, it's spacebar to drop your tool. So right now, there's a couple of things in Modo that we're going to want to learn about, and that's the differences between items and components. So item is basically this mesh layer here inside your new scene. We don't really, if I hit move tool, you can see we move that. It's going to move the whole item over there, and it's going to change its position here in the item properties tab. I generally only work in item mode. So this is the item selection mode up here. If you want to animate your object, but when I model it, I'm going to do an undo real quick, get it back to the center of my scene. I'm going to do all my modeling in one of these component level editors. So polygons, or the faces as they're called in other programs, is how I select through the polygons. Do edges, that's how I select just these edges in Modo. Double click is going to select an edge loop, as we see here. So I don't have to actually select one. Hold shift, select another. Hold shift to add to your selection. Control will select from your selection. Or again, double click will do that whole loop for your edges. Likewise with vertices or points they're called. I can just select those. Or now if we hit spacebar, it's going to kind of cycle through each one of those 3 selection modes. So spacebar is going to go to your verts, continue hitting spacebar, it's going to jump through your different selection modes. You'll also notice those actually saved in there. So I had one polygon selected. If I hold another one, spacebar, cycle back. Our edges are still selected in there, and our polygons are still selected in there. So once we're in a component level selection set, that's how we want to model our cup in. So I could lasso select this top polygon, which is right click and drag and drop. That will do a lasso selection. Likewise, I can lasso select it down here, or I can just select that polygon here in our perspective viewport. One thing, if you want to know, the viewport tumbling would be options and a tumble around your object. I'm going to do option and hold shift at the same time. That's going to pan in that viewport. Or option control is going to zoom in that viewport. You also have access to all those tools up in these little widgets here on top. So if I just click on that widget and hold, that will move. Click on this widget and hold, it will rotate. Click on this widget and move, that will zoom. And one nice thing, if I zoom inside one of these orthographic views, all 3 of these are linked up together. So we're going to keep the same sort of framing throughout these 3 orthographic views, but we have our own control for the perspective viewport. And if you're coming from another application, right now Modo has trackball rotation on in its viewports, and a lot of people don't like that. So if you're coming from another 3D app, most people really want to turn off that trackball rotation. I personally like it, but if you do want to turn off the way it rotates in your perspective viewport, you're going to want to hover your mouse over that viewport and hit O on the keyboard, so O for options. Come to the drawing and control, and down here it has mouse control, trackball rotation, and you can turn that to no if you like. And that's more kind of standard how other 3D applications, no matter where you click and pull in this UI, it's going to rotate around that object. But again, I personally like to leave it on the default for Modo. So when I click and pull, it's going to rotate just a little bit different. If you're new to Modo, maybe just keep it as is. But if you're coming from another application, you don't want to kind of change that trackball rotation. All right, that's enough about the UI. Let's get into actually modeling this cup. So I know I want it to be a little bit wider, so I'm going to hit R for my scale tool. And right now I'm in the polygon mode. So if I click this blue handle, it's only going to scale it in the Z-axis. I'm going to undo again. If I pull it in the red handle, it's only going to scale in our X-axis. You can see over here in the tool properties. But if you want to do a uniform scale between two axes, it's this little green widget in between those two handles. So if I click and pull that guy, you'll see now both the X and the Z are scaling at the same time. So that's how we're going to do a proportional scale for our object and get it roughly in the shape of our glass. Now you might notice I have no polygon selected when I did that. If I had only this selected in our scale tool, it's only going to scale that top polygon. I'm going to undo. Or if I double clicked, it's going to select all our polygons. And that's kind of how we were before. But one nice thing to note inside of Modo is if no polygons are selected or no vertices are selected, all of them are selected. So once we have that move tool, I'm going to hit spacebar to drop my selection. Drop my tool. So spacebar will drop your tool. But now we have a selection. If I wanted to drop my selection, I'm going to click in a blank area in the UI. So if I click this polygon, if I want to deselect it, anywhere in, not on a selected mesh, anywhere in this blank viewport, it's going to drop your selection. So now we have the outer sort of shell of our whiskey glass formed. Right now you see here, this is our ground plane. I'm going to want to go to the Move tool. So again, access it over here in the basic menu, or just hit W on the keyboard for Move tool. You're going to really want to get used to these shortcuts here. So I'm going to move it up in our viewport here. So again, you can notice it's really faceted. You're going to say that's not a round whiskey glass. But if you hit Tab in Modo, that's going to do a subdivide. So it's going to smooth everything out. Clearly, it turned that cylinder kind of into an oblong sort of sphere. But we're going to show you how to work around that pretty soon here. But before too long, I want to kind of start beginning to rough out the whiskey glass and get our actual shape in there. So we need a hole down the center of our glass. So I'm going to again hit 0 on the numpad to zoom full screen, or that little maximize icon. I'm going to zoom in here, look at the top polygon. I'm going to select that top polygon, and we want to create a hole, or we want to create a bevel. So to do that, we're going to use our Bevel modifier tool, click it here. And if I right click in the UI, that will bring up our tool handles. So this red one here is going to do our inset, how we want to actually inset that bevel. And the blue handle here is going to show how much we want to shift. So all we really want to do right now, I just hit undo, is create that upper lip of the glass. So we want it to be, relatively thin. Glasses are often, pretty thin. So we're going to create one bevel right here. Now I'm going to do spacebar, and I'm going to drop my tool. Okay. Now let's activate the bevel tool again. So I'm going to hit B again. And if I just click and drag in the UI, you'll see if I click and pull up and down, it will shift, and left and right will inset, but you're kind of getting sloppy. We know we want this to go just straight down. So I'm going to undo that, and we can either just take this inset little widget here and drag them up or down, or what I want to do is just right click in the UI, bring up our handle, and pull it all the way down almost to the bottom of the glass. So now we're starting to get that form of that glass in here. And always refer back to your reference. You can see most of these glasses, the inner cup size actually doesn't go to the bottom. There's a little bit of room down here. Not every glass has that, but most of them you'll see has this little space. So when we want to do that final bevel, we don't want it to actually go all the way down here. In this instance, you could, but we'll just leave it right about here. Again, now spacebar and drop your tool. And now click anywhere in the UI to drop that selection. So now if I hit Tab to do that smooth, you're going to see we're starting to actually get a nice sort of soft mesh here, but it doesn't actually hold the form at all. There's, we don't want this big sort of round shape here on the bottom. So I'm gonna hit Tab again to unsmooth or unsubdivide. And now we need to add some geometry to kind of hold those edges. You'll understand more about that as we go along. So to do that, well, you're going to use the Bevel tool just like we did before, but this time we're actually going to only bevel those edges. So we can come up and either hit spacebar and jump to our edge selection mode, or just actually pick it here. Another shortcut would be 1, 2, or 3 on the top numbers of your keypad. You'll see those indicated here. This always shows you what the keyboard equivalent shortcut is for these tools. So we'll just go to our edges here, and I showed you briefly before, but if I just double click this edge, it's going to select that whole edge loop. So instead of holding one edge or trying to draw out our selection, we can get them all, obviously. If we hold one, we can hold shift, grab the next one. We're just going to double click that whole edge loop, and we're going to use that same bevel tool. So I'm going to come up and either activate the tool here in our basic menu, or I'm just going to hit B. B is the shortcut, as you see, for our edge. So the same tool is going to be used for either polygons, edges, or vertices. It's the same B, it's the same bevel tool. So now if I just click and pull in our UI, you're going to see it's going to start putting in some nice round level on that bottom of the glass. And if we zoom in here, you'll see there's a handful of edge spans it created. So we have a round level on. So if I drag this little slider, it'll be a round level of 0, and it's not going to create any sort of roundness to that bevel. But if I click and continue to add a few up, it's going to start adding a few of those edge spans. In this case, because we're doing our subdivide at render time by hitting Tab, 2 is going to hold that edge just fine. So now I can either hit spacebar, or I'm going to hit spacebar, and drop my tool, click in the UI in a blank area, or not on any selected, and that's going to drop my selection. Now you'll notice when we hit Tab, it's holding that edge a lot better. The top is still doing some funky things here, so we're going to have to edge bevel those. Likewise with the inside. So hit Tab in and out, and we're going to be doing this all the time. We're going to hit Tab to smooth our mesh, take a look at it. Notice this edge looks pretty good. Hit Tab to go back. And I generally do all my edge bevels and any sort of my bevel tools in the non-tabbed or on the non-subdivided mesh. So let's double click this inside mesh here, this inside edge ring. Let's hit B again for bevel, click and pull, and just get a nice little inside radius for that glass. Spacebar drop your tool, click in the UI to drop our selection, hit Tab, and now we can see that view is nicely holding that edge form. So now we want to add a little bit of roundness to these top edges. So I'm going to double click that one, hold shift now, and double click this next edge. So shift adds to your selection. I could do one here, hold shift on this one. Now shift double click will do that. I can also select one edge, hit L for loop. That's going to loop my selection, same sort of thing, and hold shift and double click the next one. Since we want this radius to be the same on both these edges, when I do my edge bevel, I want both of those edges to be selected. So again, let's activate our B or our bevel tool by hitting B or clicking the tool over here. And now just click and pull, click and drag to the right in your UI. And let's just create that little round level up here on top of the glass. Spacebar, drop your tool, click somewhere on not a non-selected item or blank place in your UI to drop your selection. Now hit Tab, and guess what? There we go. We have a very nice, round, smooth-looking glass. Now, if you zoom in closely, I'm not sure the video recording will pick this up, but you can tell it's not totally smooth. You can kind of see these little edges here that we know is not going to be a completely round level. So what is that? Well, that's how many times it's actually subdividing when you hit that Tab tool. And how to know how much it's going to actually subdivide is over here on your mesh. So we go to our mesh, look at the mesh properties, and down here on the bottom, we see the subdivision settings. Now my screen's a little short now because I'm doing the screen capture, but this little icon here, these two arrows, indicates there's more to this menu. So if I click that little menu, it's going to bring up this floating palette, and you can see our subdivision level right now is set to 2, and our render level is set to 2 as well. If I click and add more, you'll briefly, or not briefly, but you'll notice that that smoothness actually got a lot smoother. But currently that only got smoother in our UI here, not actually at render time. So if I actually did a render, those edges will still be slightly faceted. So I'm going to drop this back down to 2 for our subdivision level, but at render time, we might want to beef that up to 3 or maybe even 4. Generally 3 should be enough. So when we render it, it's actually going to subdivide a handful of times. Now if you're new to Modo or new to 3D, you're not quite sure what I actually mean by subdivide. So let's just take a look at some of the subdivide options. Tab is the more generic, not generic, but the more useful one, because you can kind of jump in and out of that soft sort of smoothing. But the way to actually add geometry at subdivision level is using the subdivide tool here. So if I hit that D, or subdivide, the shortcut is D for divide. You can see it actually added edge spans here. I hit it again, it added more edge spans. Now, so this is pretty much the same smoothness level we did when we hit tab. The problem is we can't really go in and out of that. Once we sort of make some modifiers, there's no undo. So we're stuck with this real sort of heavy mesh, which might be fine for what you want to model. So if I hit tab now, it will still do that smoothing, but just look how much geometry it's adding at this point in time. So I'm going to undo a few times. Undo that subdivide. So subdivide just means adding more geometry or adding smoothing. Again, we're going to keep our mesh relatively light here and just hit tab to smooth at render time. Okay, I think that's enough about subdivision. So now we have our glass, but we don't actually have our liquid. So real quickly, before we get too far along, I'm going to hit save. And you can see that little asterisk on the item just saved it, or it went away. If I make a modify, a move, undo, you'll see there's a little asterisk by the name. That just means our scene has not been saved. So one thing I want to do is name our item. So right now this is that default mesh item that came in Modo. It's called mesh. But if I just click on it, it's going to enter into our text editor. And I want to call this glass. You could have also done that down here on the mesh properties tab and rename that whatever you like, but we'll just again name that glass. So right now we want to actually create the inside liquid. Now we could go back up to our primitive tool, draw a cylinder, and try to match just what the shape of that, but there's no real need for that. What we want to do is use our existing polygons to create our liquid mesh layer. Again, that's going to be its own sort of shell, its own sort of 3D mesh will be the liquid itself. So the way I always do that, so we're just going to use the geometry we already have inside this glass. So I'm going to go into our polygon selection mode, click that center polygon, and now we want to start selecting all of the polygons around it to get up to this outer shell. So if I just hold shift and paint over this selection, we can select all those polygons. And that will basically be the template for our liquid. But you can tell that kind of took a long time. We had to paint, and you might grab an extra one up here. Oh, you don't mean to select that one. Now we're going to hit Control to deselect. Right now I'm going to just deselect all polygons and show you a nice, very handy keyboard shortcut. So let's hit select that center polygon again by just being in polygon selection and clicking it. Now if I hold shift on the keyboard and up arrow, as you can see here, it's going to grow that selection all the way up to the top. If if I do shift and down arrow, it's going to grow our selection down. So it's a much quicker way than actually painting, rotating, and selecting all those polygons. It's simply growing your selection by hitting shift up arrow. So now we have the general inside polygons, which are going to be our liquid form, but we want to get those into its own mesh layer. Right now that's still kind of stuck in this glass form. So much like in any sort of program, if I wanted to copy those polygons, I can just use a keyboard shortcut of Command or Control C, and we just copy those to our clipboard. You can either come up to that top menu here, the Edit menu, select Copy itself, or you can right-click on that selection. I thought Copy was in there. I guess it's not. I apologize. So either Command or Control C, Copy, or come up to Edit. So now we've copied those polygons. But if I hit Paste, it's going to put them right on top of this mesh. It's going to be hard to select them. So what I want to actually do is create a new item type in our item list. Not a new item type, a new blank mesh layer. So if I come to this little drop-down menu in our item list, and we can choose Mesh. It's right here on the top. And now you can see this background item went into a wireframe, and we have this empty mesh layer. Again, it's empty because it's grayed out. And now I want to paste that by just doing Command V, Control V. And now just those polygons to be selected are in that empty mesh layer. If we click the top one, there's our glass. You see the wireframe from the one below. Or now we have our new liquid layer. So I'm going to name this guy. Let's just call this liquid, or we know we're creating whiskey in this case. So click rename it. And it's a good mindset to always just kind of rename and name your scene as you go along. It's also a really good thing to hit save. Either come up here, hit save, or the standard, obviously, keyboard shortcut is Command or Control S. So if we look at our scene, we don't actually want that liquid to be all the way up in our glass. Right now, that top shell is. So what I want to do is grab that top edge and pull it down. Or we can grab the points. Doesn't always have to be the edge. So if I right click and create a lasso all the way right around it, it's going to select just those points. Or again, edge, double click that top loop, select all those, go to our move tool by hitting W, and let's just pull those down just on the green axis, which is Y. And this is the height, essentially, of our liquid in our glass. This will be dependent on what you want to do, but I'm going to put it right about here. Spacebar to drop my move tool. So if I didn't move and I actually clicked in the UI accidentally, you'll see we're going to move it over there. That's not what we want. So you always want to spacebar and drop your tool. So that's the height of our liquid, but there's no real actual top to it. It's just an empty shell right now. And it's also facing the wrong direction. Our polygons are facing inwards. You can see they're kind of x-rayed here. The ones we want them actually facing outwards, not in. So we can either come up here. Let's see. Not too sure where the shortcut is. Flip those polygons. Let's see. Well, regardless, this is a shortcut you're going to want to use all the time, and it's actually F to flip those. You'll find that here also on these little side tools under Polygon. There's this flip. And if you see that, it's going to flip those polygons. Now they're facing outwards, and that's what we want. The inside of the glass, we obviously want those polygons facing inside, but since we have our liquid, we want it facing outwards. So now, again, F on the keyboard, and you can tell we have no polygon selected, which means all of them, again, are selected. If I double-click this and hit F, it's going to do the same thing, but I often work with no polygon selected. So we need a top to this. We need a cap. So it's pretty simple to do that. We're going to go back into our edge, double-click this, and now what we want to do is create a polygon. So if we wanted to close this hole, again, we want to create a polygon there. There's a couple ways. The easiest way, again, just select all those edges, then come onto your polygon menu here and choose the make command. It's going to bring this dialog box, hit OK, and there we go. We just made a polygon in that hole. I'm going to undo one time again, and the keyboard shortcut for this is just P. P for polygon is going to fill that hole. So that's one way to do it, is by the edge. It's the quickest and easiest way I've found, but sometimes you want to just select the points. If you did want to select the points you want to close, you want to do it in a clockwise manner. So one, continue to draw these on, select all the points, and then hit again make or hit P to make that polygon. The reason you go in clockwise, you want to select them in order. That's how it knows to do a nice closed polygon. If I selected this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, and hit P, you're going to see it's going to create this kind of jumbled geometry. If we went counterclockwise, it's going to make your polygon face in the other direction. But once again, we're going to just do 2, double click, P for polygon, and there we go. There's our liquid. But once again, if I hit tab, it's going to create this sort of bubbled mesh because we don't have any geometry up here on top. You guys already know how to do this. Double click that edge loop, come up to your basic menu and choose bevel, or again, this keyboard shortcut B for bevel. And just put a little bit of bevel here on the edge. Just a slight one, because there's going to be a little bit of water tension. There's going to be a slightly beveled there. Spacebar, drop your tool, click in the UI, hit tab, and there we go. We have a nice liquid mesh. But you can see the glass we don't have subdivided, so I'm going to jump back up to the glass menu, hit tab for this guy. Now you can see if I hold shift in this item menu, we can select both those items. So now we can see our glass is right, our water or liquid is right there inside. Again, 0 on the numpad, or hit this icon to zoom back. And now we can see our liquid inside that glass. So before we get too long, this will end the chapter shortly, but when you're doing any of this sort of glass refraction, or liquid, instead of a glass refraction, a real little, quick little trick is you actually want that to be penetrating the inside of this glass form. It sounds a little counterintuitive because in the real world, your glass is sitting on the inside, but just a Modo trick for getting better and proper liquid reflection or refraction is you want to scale your liquid up just a hair. So so it's actually breaking inside of the center edge here. We'll see that when we actually render it, but before we get too long, let's actually just model that properly. So we showed you a couple of those widgets before, but if you actually click the center one inside your scale tool, and click and pull, it's going to do a uniform axis all the way around. And you want to get it just a little bit, again, so that's breaking just slightly into the glass itself. We'll get more on that in render time, but before we move too far along, let's just handle that. So there we go. We have a glass and we have our whiskey or our liquid rendered. That's it for this chapter. The next one, I'll show you how to actually model a different glass being this shape here.